Happy New Year and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the January 2023 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I'm Chris Furman, the regional climatologist with NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past couple of months since our last webinar back in November. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. Joining us today, we have Karen Gleason from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, who will be giving us a recap of the weather and climate in the Southeast over the past year. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to this recording within the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. So temperatures over the past 2 months have been above average across the region, especially across Alabama and parts of Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, where some locations have been running over 6 degrees Fahrenheit above average. If we look across the rest of North Carolina, much of southern Florida, and southern Virginia, we see temperatures running slightly above average over the past couple of months. On the right, we see the mean temperature anomalies for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which also show near to slightly above average temperatures. Okay, next slide. Now, while we have seen unseasonably warm weather for much of the past couple months, the big story, as you may recall, was the Arctic outbreak that struck the region for several days around the Christmas holiday. The map on the left here shows that minimum temperatures dropped below freezing as far south as the I-4 corridor in central Florida, while temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit across the southern Appalachians. Now, how unusual were the coldest temperatures during this outbreak? On the right, we see the mean temperature anomalies for December 24th, the coldest day during the outbreak. And what we see are temperatures running between 20 and up to 35 degrees Fahrenheit below average across the Southeast, including Florida. In fact, some locations across central Alabama and central Georgia didn't get out of the teens on this day. Of the stations shown in this figure, over half recorded their coldest or tied their coldest mean temperature on this day. I'll also note that very high winds were associated with this event, some as high as 60 miles an hour, and these contributed to numerous power outages, particularly across North Carolina and Virginia. There were also impacts to agriculture in the region, and Pam's going to cover those in her presentation. Okay, next slide. So in terms of precipitation, it's been quite wet across northern sections of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, also extending through central portions of North Carolina and Virginia. It's also been quite wet and even a bit snowy and icy across higher elevations of North Carolina. However, much of Florida, particularly the Panhandle, as well as southern Georgia and coastal sections of the Carolinas, have been relatively dry over the past couple of months. And although we are in the dry season, precipitation deficits have started to build again in parts of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And you can see that in the anomaly map from Climate Perspectives there on the right-hand side. Okay, next slide. So no surprise, these precipitation patterns line up with the current drought monitor, which shows an eastward shift and overall decline in drought coverage over the past couple of months. Severe drought, though, continued to plague parts of the Florida Panhandle, specifically along the Big Bend region. And we see moderate drought extending from the Florida Panhandle up through southern Georgia and eastern sections of the Carolinas and Virginia. These, of course, are where the precipitation deficits have been the greatest. In contrast, the wet conditions seen over the interior of the region have eliminated the drought that had been intensifying, particularly the area of severe drought across central and northern Georgia that had originally emerged back in October. Okay, next slide. However, we are likely to see improvements in the drought monitor this week as a large swath of precipitation was observed across these drought-stricken areas this past weekend. This is a map showing radar estimated totals from Sunday morning to yesterday morning when most of this precipitation fell, and it shows a broad area of 1 to 3 inches extending from around Tallahassee up to southeastern North Carolina. When including the precipitation that fell on Saturday, the day before, some areas received over 3 inches of precipitation from this event, which is certainly good news for the drought. Okay, next slide. Looking in the Caribbean, we see small areas of abnormally dry conditions emerging again across coastal sections of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. It's worth noting that St. Thomas recorded its 5th driest December on record with just 0.82 inches of precipitation, and St. Croix recorded its 2nd driest December with just 0.6 of an inch. Both of these are records that extend back 70 plus years. Okay, next slide. So after 3 consecutive years of La Nina, we are beginning, or are about to begin, depending on which models you use, a transition to ENSO-neutral conditions in the equatorial Pacific that is expected to continue over the next several months. According to the latest guidance released earlier this month by the Climate Prediction Center, this transition is anticipated during the February to April period, with an over 80% chance of ENSO-neutral conditions prevailing by the end of the spring season. Okay, next slide. Now, we need to remember that we're still in a La Nina. CPC continues to maintain a La Nina advisory, and the projections over the next few months are more or less consistent with this pattern. Above average temperatures are expected across the southeast, with the highest probabilities across the southern tier of the region. Precipitation is leaning below average across Florida and the Gulf Coast, with equal chances of above or below average precipitation across much of the rest of the region, except maybe in the extreme interior of the region, which may see above average precipitation over the next 3 months. Okay, next slide. Given the forecast for warm and especially dry conditions across Florida, drought development is likely across the peninsula, while the other areas of the southeast currently in drought are expected to remain in drought over the next few months. Drought development is not currently anticipated for the remainder of the region, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Next slide. So looking ahead to next week, above average temperatures are likely across much of the region, while precipitation is leaning above average, except in South Florida. Next slide. In fact, parts of the Florida Panhandle, as well as southern portions of Alabama and Georgia, could see between 2 and 3 inches, maybe even more, over the next 7 days, providing even more drought relief to this part of the region. Next slide. Looking out to 2 weeks, generally warm and wet weather is expected across much of the region, with near normal precipitation expected across the Florida Peninsula. Next slide. And as we get into mid-February, it's looking like above average temperatures will persist, with equal chances of above or below average precipitation across the region. And next slide should be the summary. Yep, and here's a summary for you to look over after the webinar. Also happy to answer any questions at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So we'll start off by looking at overall over the whole southeast and the 28-day average stream flows. And this is a big change from what we were seeing back in November when we spoke. We were really, as we were getting through the fall, we were really starting to dry out a lot of the southeast, and we were concerned that we were really dipping into a drought for the winter. And just because we were with CPC's forecast, the Climate Prediction Center's forecast of dry weather, we were concerned about it. Fortunately and unfortunately, all depending on how you want to look at it, we've seen a lot of rain that has kept us out of drought, and we have had some flooding across the southeast. So as we look at the big picture across the whole southeast, the areas for drought that we're most concerned about are the eastern areas of North Carolina and Virginia, where stream flows are below average in those areas because we haven't seen very much rainfall. And the other area is in Florida. But for the most part, as you look at the graph on the right hand, that kind of is the average runoff for the southeast. Those are duration hydrographs, and we've stayed in that as a whole. We've stayed pretty normal for most of the time. We follow the climatology pattern with it getting dry in that late fall, and then we getting wetter as we go through the early part of the year. So let's go ahead and look a little bit more closely at each of the states. And the first one we'll look at is Alabama. And again, you're going to see this pattern, I think, mostly through all of these, is that again in the October and November timeframe, we started to drift into the below normal. And then as we got into late November and early December, we wet very quickly. But because we were so dry, we did get a lot of rainfall. And so we've really kind of stayed in the normal range for Alabama, but it's increased significantly from where it was. And again, our biggest concern was that we were going to stay dry during that time. But so a similar pattern for Georgia, where we really did get dry, and as was mentioned before, we were starting to see a great deal of drought in the northern part of the state, in addition to what we were seeing in the southern part of the state. Well, that has ended. So the northern part of the state has seen a great deal of rainfall, and that's helped stream flows on those rivers that flow from the northern part of the state through the rest of the state. Where we're having some issues is in some of those rivers that aren't in the northern part of the state, that originate down in the southern part of the state, and that's where our stream flows are pretty low. But overall, our stream flows are in decent conditions. As for Florida, wow, it's been an interesting year for Florida. As they, we know that with the couple of hurricanes in September, we saw significant rainfall from our two big hurricanes, Ian and Nicole, and so we were very high and well above normal in many parts of the state. But in addition to that, even though we were above normal, much of the Swanee Basin up in northern Florida and southern Georgia didn't get quite as much rain. So as we progressed from the middle of September through now, we have really started to dry out, and it's not drying out everywhere. We still have part of the state that's near normal in the central part of the state, but our areas up near Swanee and again in North Florida and South Georgia have really started to dry out. So there is a concern there, but as mentioned before, it's their dry season. So when they're dry during the dry season, it's not quite the same impact as when it's dry during the wet season, because they just don't expect that rain this much this time of year. So let's go ahead and go to the next slides and look up into the Carolinas. And so here's South Carolina, and it's the same pattern as our Georgia and our Alabama, where we were dry during that November timeframe in the fall, but we really have wetted up and things have improved. And over most of South Carolina, as opposed to what we'll see in North Carolina, which is looking at it a little bit differently. We were seeing very much a drought, but and we're improving in the mountainous areas and in the western half of the state. But in the eastern half of the state, we're still not getting quite as much rainfall. And so we starting to see it creep down and possibly getting into some dryness. So there's this kind of this battle between the wetness and the dryness in each half of the state that kind of, so in some ways that this graph is misleading in that we're normal, but only because half the state's wet and half the state's dry. And so we will be watching that very closely as we get into the rest of the winter and go into spring. And then for Virginia, very much the same thing. As we stay dry, we've gotten wet. It is starting to come off a little bit more quickly as they've been more dry recently. And so yes, so very much the same pattern of most of the Southeast. So let's go ahead and go on to our next graphic. And this is just our river conditions as of yesterday. And we do have many points in action stage, a few heading to flood stage, just a mix of things across the Southeast. In the Carolinas, we're really not seeing that much flooding. We did get some water in some of those rivers and are seeing water move through those areas. But overall, we haven't seen much flooding there, just like we haven't seen since September, since we stopped our St. Johns River flood sometime in late December. We finally came out of flood in there. We're not seeing that much flooding through Florida. So Florida ends up being quiet, but we expect that this time of year. So things are looking pretty normal. So let's go to the next slide to see what normal is. And so our normal for this time of year, so we look at our climatology for flooding in the Southeast. And we're in week 4 now, and we're really ramping up as we get to the end of December and we start to approach the middle to late March. This is our flooding season, and there's 2 ways to look at that. It's a recharge season for a lot of reservoirs that need to fill up or groundwater that needs to fill up, but it's also flooding season. So because when we get rainfall, there's not as much competition for the water, and we tend to get a lot more runoff and flooding during this time. So we really are ramping up through the spring, or into the spring as we go forward through the winter, and this is very early parts of this. So we expect it to remain active as it has been. We've been getting rain about every 4 to 6 days in the southeast, and has kept things wet. So in most areas, except for those areas that were shown in drought before, down in South Georgia and kind of along the East Coast, we're pretty primed to get some flooding during that time if we start to see more rainfall. We've been fortunate over the last couple of weeks that the rainfall events have not been excessive. We have had some heavier rainfalls, but we've had enough dryness in between them that we've seen a little bit of flooding, but nothing in the significant range. We haven't seen moderate and major flooding or any destructive flooding, but we will be watching for that because we've had enough rain that we're primed to have some issues if we do see some of those heavy rainfalls. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So for our winter flood outlook, and I apologize, I did not change the December through February. I meant to change that, and that was supposed to be January through February through April. And it looks like a near normal risk for river flooding over most of the areas, especially over most of the southeast. There's 2 areas, and I mentioned this, and you'll be able to read it when you get the slides tomorrow, a little bit of the dialogue, but really it's pretty normal for this time of year, simply because this is what we expect during this time of year. And if you look in the eastern part of North Carolina, there's less of a chance, a below normal risk for river flooding, just because we haven't seen quite the rainfall. We're pretty dry right now. We still have the La Niña, so the CPC forecast says we shouldn't expect much rainfall there, and so that's part of the reason we're below normal. And then I have this area in between these near normal risks that's kind of, it's not brown, but it's not, and that's just because for this time of year it is the dry season. So when I saw near normal risk for river flooding, we don't expect river flooding during this time of year typically in Florida at all. We just don't see it usually. Rainy season doesn't kick up until May or so in that area, and that's when we expect their flooding season. So because their rivers are up, and because they've been a little bit dry, we're calling for near normal risk for flooding for that area. So we'll go ahead and go on to the last slide. And this is just my overview, and this will give you an opportunity when you after to be able to read this, and if you have any questions at the end, let me know. And with that, I will pass it off to Pam.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you're all here. You might think it's a little dead time for agriculture, but I have a pasture full of new calves outside my window this morning, and so farmers are still busy. And we'll talk just about a few of the impacts here before we get on with Karen. So let's move on. Chris showed this earlier, that one of the biggest impacts over the last couple of months has been this really cold weather that we've had over time. Freezing temperatures got all the way down to, I think, Sebring, Florida, so really far south in the interior peninsula, and resulted in a lot of frost damage to crops like citrus and also to pastures. And so those are things that farmers are really looking at now. If we go on. Soil temperature generally, because we've had fairly warm temperatures lately, soil temperatures in most places are a little bit ahead of normal, except for in Florida, where they're still recovering from the cold temperatures and also having, a little bit of wetness in the soil still that's remaining from the hurricanes earlier in the year. So soil temperature there has been a little bit cooler, and the soil moisture shown on the right-hand side there generally has been pretty dry. Keep in mind that this map was created before the rain this past weekend, and so some of those areas are probably reduced somewhat now if we looked at today's map. So soil moisture is a little bit lower than some people would like, especially in southeast Georgia, but I think that will be improving, as Chris mentioned earlier. If we go on, one of the big questions I get a lot this time of year is chill hour accumulation. And this is a chill hour for Jefferson County, which is in north central Florida, just south of the border with Georgia. The yellow line is the long-term average of chill hour accumulation for fruit. Every year now it seems it's above normal in temperature, so it's not surprising that the chill hour should be running below that long-term average over time. And you can see for that station, it's pretty close to the same number of chill hours that they accumulated last year. So we're likely to see a chill hour accumulation total by the end of the season that's similar to what we had last year. And so, that's something to keep in mind. I've heard from some producers in Southwest Georgia that some of the southern highbush blueberries are already blooming, and they are worried about frost protection. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. And I did want to mention, if you use agroclimate to get Georgia's weather station data for peaches or other crops, we did get hit by a tornado on January 12. We're still recovering from that. We've got most everything fixed, but one of the things that still needs to be worked on is the connection to agroclimate. We hope to have that up in the next couple of days. We got an 81.1 mile per hour gust on the campus before the station got nailed by a piece of greenhouse. And so, and we have a truck that got totaled by a tree. So it's been an interesting couple of weeks trying to recover from that. But we're well aware that people use it, and we'll get it back online as soon as we can. If we go on, the freeze probability I mentioned, if you look at this, this is the map of the 90% chance of last freeze, which means 9 out of 10 years, you're going to get another 32-degree frost after that. And this week, we're in the salmon, sort of orange salmon colored. You can see that for really all of the Southeast, except for Florida and the immediate coast of Georgia, we still have a 9 out of 10% chance or better of getting another freeze yet this year. And so, it's, if you do frost protection now, you may have to do it again, even if you're in those southern counties. Really looking ahead, we don't see any immediate sign of another frost, but there are some indications in the long-term models that it could go back to a cooler pattern later in February or in March. Last year we had frost in April, so we're not out of the woods yet, but something to keep in mind. I don't expect we're going to see anything like the outbreak we had in December. So let's go on. Some of the impacts of recent conditions on agriculture. The frost caused damage to many varieties of forage. It's been interesting to me to see what things got damaged and what didn't. I saw one video that farmers showed that their kale plants did just fine, which is not surprising because that's a cold season plant. But other crops did not do well. And you can see the picture on the left there shows what happened to different kinds of forage crops when subjected to those cold temperatures. Some things did well, some things did not do well at all. Some citrus plants were frost protected, but really there's no way to tell at this point how much damage was done. You have to kind of wait and see if it grows out. Same thing is true with grapes. A lot of strawberries have been produced. Most farmers put row covers on those and found that if they put two row covers on instead of one, they got a lot better protection. So that's something to keep in mind. But the frost damage did make the plants more susceptible to fungal diseases. And so farmers are really having to scout those carefully and try to get rid of any plants that have fungal diseases on them so that it doesn't spread to other plants. And as I mentioned before, the recent warm weather has resulted in the blooming of some blueberry varieties. And so we'll be watching that very closely in the next few weeks. We go on. Here's my summary that you can read later. I want to make sure I give plenty of time to our guest speaker today. So I'm very happy to introduce Kieran Gleason, who's going to talk about the 2022 state of the climate in the Southeast. Take it away, Kieran.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks, Meredith, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone who's attending today. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about some of the highlights. I'm sure there are other things I could talk about besides the things that I'm talking, but given the time constraints, I tried to figure out what were the kind of the big takeaways. And so, of course, we have to talk about temperature in 2022. So here we have the NCEI percentile maps and the state rank maps. By and large, most of the country was above average temperature-wise. The lower 48 had its 18th warmest year. And Meredith, if you could forward one notch here. Across the Southeast, We saw that it wasn't quite that warm. It actually ended up being 42nd warmest year for the Southeast region. But within the region, Florida ranked 5th warmest, with the remaining southeastern states ranking above average or in the warmest third of that 128-year history. Next slide. Looking at precipitation, the same kinds of maps. So the browns denote, below average, and the green shades are above average precipitation. Overall, for the contiguous U.S., it was the 27th driest year. We see the parts that are brownish on the left, certainly much of the west, much of the central plains. Across the southeast, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, depending on where you're at. Certainly, Georgia, the panhandle of Florida, and the Carolinas, by and large, had below average precipitation, with parts of Alabama and Virginia and central and southern Florida being above average. Forward one notch here, Meredith. And we look at the southeast and the ranks. So as I said, the contiguous U.S. had the 27th driest year. For the southeast, it was below average, but not quite 27th. It ended up being 43rd driest for the region. We saw Georgia, North Carolina ranking below average, with Alabama, Florida, South Carolina overall near average, and Virginia above average for the year as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so turning our attention to drought, and I know we've already heard a lot about kind of the immediate recent history of drought, but I kind of wanted to kind of step through 2022 sort of qualitatively. And this is a time series, of course, from the U.S. Drought Monitor. Looking at the beginning of 2022 across the southeast, we see that the year began with moderate to severe drought across about 20% of the region, and that included parts of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Those areas of drought were reduced to nearly nothing by the early February period. And in March, we saw drought formation along some of the Gulf Coast states and along Georgia to North Carolina coast. In the April to June time period, moderate and severe drought were present along the coast and from Georgia to North Carolina, as well as in South Florida during April and May. Mid-year, looking at June, it was really dry and quite warm across much of the southeast, which allowed drought to expand and intensify further inland during June and into early July. Summer rainfall helped eliminate most drought across the southeast in August. And then dry, warm conditions across Alabama, Georgia, and the panhandle of Florida made way for some moderate and severe drought development in the months of October and November. And by the end of the year, moderate and severe drought was intact across the Florida panhandle, South Alabama, Georgia, and moderate drought across portions of the eastern Carolinas. So that was probably more than you wanted to know, but I figured it was worth kind of emphasizing two spots during the year, sort of the spring and summer months, and then in the fall where we had a drought reblossom. Next slide. Looking at those periods of the minimum and maximum extent of drought across the southeast, we see that on August 23rd, and you might have to get your spectacles out for this, but about 0.5% of the region was in moderate drought, our lowest drought category. And if you look really closely, upstate of South Carolina, portions of east central Florida, and the northwestern tip of Alabama have smidgens of drought present at that time. And then just a few months later, November 8th was our maximum extent at about 31.5%. We see extensive areas of moderate to severe drought from the Florida panhandle across parts of Alabama, Georgia, into the Carolinas, and some small amounts of moderate drought in Virginia. All right, next slide. Oops, I think that was the wrong way. There we go. All right, so I really like this graphic. This is a map that one of my colleagues put together looking at the shape files from the U.S. Drought Monitor that illustrates the number of weeks. So if you really kind of want to look at 22 as a whole, clearly there's a bullseye in the west in the Central Plains where essentially they spent the entire year in some level of drought. But as we kind of look towards the southeastern region, there actually were several locations that experienced 0 weeks of drought, which is fantastic. The vast majority of the region spent between, a week and probably a dozen weeks in some measure of drought, with sort of like the maximum along the Carolina coast, probably just a little north of Wilmington there, maybe in the 32 to 36 week range. So a little bit more than half of the year, but overall, certainly could have been worse across the southeast. And as was already mentioned, we kind of faded in and out of some dry periods that took us into some moderate drought, but then we received some precipitation and it kind of brought us back to normal. So overall, we fared fairly well across the region for drought for the year. Thank you. Next slide. All right, so now switching gears and looking towards tropical cyclones. As many of you know, overall in the North Atlantic Basin, the hurricane season named storm count was actually near average for 2022, but it was the least active season that we've seen since 2015. Much of July and all of August had no tropical cyclone activity, which I think was big news during the time because this was anticipated. I think a lot of people anticipated that it was going to be another big year since we were still in a La Niña. And actually not having any tropical cyclone activity during August, no formation, has only happened 2 other years in the historical record. That was in 1961 and in 1997. The absence of tropical cyclone formation ended very abruptly in early September, and it was a very active month. And for the season, there were a few hurricanes that had some significant impacts, and I kind of illustrate them graphically here on the slide. So looking at Fiona on the left, this was the first major hurricane of the season, and it caused widespread flooding, damage and power outages across Puerto Rico. It also made landfall in the Dominican Republic and the Turks and Caicos Islands as a hurricane. It transitioned to an extratropical cyclone and ultimately made landfall in Nova Scotia as the strongest and costliest post-tropical cyclone on record for Canada. So that was pretty big news for those folks. Looking at the center part of the slide here, Hurricane Ian, which I think is probably the one hurricane of the season that everyone is talking about for obvious reasons. It formed in late September, rapidly intensified into a major hurricane in the Western Caribbean, and it made landfall in Cuba. And it weakened slightly and then rapidly re-intensified as it got back into the Gulf of Mexico and leading up to its landfall in Southwest Florida. Its peak intensity right before that Florida landfall was 155 miles per hour, which is just shy of Category 5 strength. Ian weakened to a tropical storm as it crossed the Florida Peninsula, dumping copious amounts of rainfall. But then it regained hurricane strength again as it re-entered the warm Atlantic waters, and it made landfall in South Carolina, causing some flooding there as well. Ian is the 3rd costliest landfalling hurricane on record at about $113 billion of cost losses. This is behind Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. And this was one of the strongest as well as the costliest storms to make landfall across the state of Florida. Looking at the right-hand side of the slide here, it was already mentioned, Hurricane Nicole was another big weather maker for Florida in 2022. And this hit the Florida coast in November and brought heavy rain and flooding. And clearly, there were many locations in Florida still recovering from Ian at this time. Statistically speaking, it was a little unusual. Nicole was the first hurricane to make landfall in Florida during November since Hurricane Kate back in 1985. So that's a little fact to put in your pocket there. All right, next slide, please. Looking at tornadoes, it's funny because there's a lot of overall statistics that talk about sort of the near average or a relatively normal year. And I think depending on where you are and what you experienced, it was either not normal or below normal, but maybe you had a normal year. There's some parts of the Southeast, I would say Alabama, which has a lot of red dots on the map on the right. A lot of those folks are used to having tornadic activity, but it was a very busy year across Alabama. It was overall for the country a near average year for actual tornado counts, with a little over 1,300 preliminary reports. Across the Southeast, though, there were about 300 preliminary tornado reports in all for the year, and just a little bit under half of those were for Alabama. Probably the most significant tornado day across the Southeast occurred on April 5th, which is indicated by the SPC map on the left. And we saw 112 tornado reports that day from Mississippi to South Carolina, and an EF4 tornado was confirmed in Pembroke, Georgia, and destroyed significant portions of several neighborhoods. And I believe there was at least 1 fatality and a number of injuries. So it was a pretty serious situation there. Next slide, please. All right, looking at snowfall now, we know that snowfall across the Southeast is not a widely expected thing, except in maybe some of the northern parts, and certainly not as big as in other parts of the country. But in 2022, there was one event that perhaps was one of the most significant events of the region that occurred in mid-January, and we saw snow that fell from northern Alabama into Georgia and up the Appalachians. Overall, between 6 to 12 inches of snow fell across portions of western North Carolina and northwestern Virginia. And this storm was categorized as a Cat 2, or a significant snow event on the regional snowfall index scale across the Southeast, with actually parts of the Ohio Valley in the Northeast receiving a lesser ranking, even though they had more snowfall. And so with that, next slide, please. These are the key takeaways, sort of like the summary stats from the overall, and I'll let you read that. And with that, I guess next slide. If you have any questions, you can reach me by email, and I've included some links if you're interested in following our climate reports, querying data in our Climate at a Glance tool, looking at some of our billion-dollar disasters statistics. And we also produced a special Hurricane Ian summary right after the event to try and get some information out on that. And feel free to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram if you don't already. But thank you for your time, and appreciate your time today. Thank you.
That was a fantastic overview, Karen. It's been an interesting year, to say the least. Good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith Muth. I am a Regional Drought Information Coordinator for the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. And NIDIS co-hosts this webinar series for over 3 years now with the Southeast Regional Climate Center, the National Weather Service, and the Southeast River Forecast Center. Before we get to questions, again, just a reminder, please put any questions or comments for the speakers that you would like to share in the question box, and we'll get to those. A reminder that we always share this webinar summary and a recording with the group either today or tomorrow for all those that registered, and feel free to share those with your networks. Our next webinar will be February 28th, where we'll take a look at a new tool to help you explore your exposure to climate risk using the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation tool. And once you leave, there'll be a quick survey, 3 questions only, to help us improve this webinar. If you have any suggested comments on topics you would like to learn more about, climate phenomena or climate impacts across the region or in your state, please do share those with us. So now I'll go ahead and get to questions and comments. One comment we just received, just kind of emphasizing the extraordinary tornado activity that we saw this year in Alabama, that this was the second busiest year for tornadoes in Alabama history since 1950. So that is pretty impressive. We do have a question related to a kind of a general one, nothing specific, and maybe some speakers could respond to this. They're asking if you know of any cloud seeding or geoengineering that actually takes place that would impact our precipitation in the region. I personally am not familiar with any of that. And if so, is that anything that we factor into our reports and outlooks and projections?
Meredith, I can discuss that.
Great, thanks, Pam.
Sure. Most of the cloud seeding efforts now are focused on the western U.S., where they were worried about snow, not so much anymore because of all the atmospheric rivers. Cloud seeding requires a very specific set of weather conditions, which don't always happen. And so they have very local effects and would not really affect the widespread precipitation patterns very much at all. It would be more of a local kind of thing. And it's not done all that often in the Southeast. There are certainly some examples, especially during times of drought. But unfortunately, when you have a drought, the atmospheric conditions really aren't very suitable for doing much effective cloud seeding. And so I don't think that they really put that into their outlooks at all. It might be a local community might be interested in that, but other than that, it would not fall in the scale that would be appropriate for looking at outlooks for the whole region.
Excellent, thank you, Pam. Our next question is related to severe weather in the winter. Is there any, and I open this up to any of the panelists, is there any observations on the repeated cycles of severe weather across the South and Gulf Coast region that we have seen this winter so far? And are we starting to see a trend of more severe weather in the winter?
I can probably, this is Karen Gleason, I can probably hit a little bit of that. We haven't done any analysis, but I know sort of qualitatively in talking with some of my colleagues, one of the things that we're seeing, and certainly, it's entirely possible that, in a warming world, your more transitional seasons aren't necessarily spring and fall anymore. They might be a little earlier and a little later in the calendar year. And so one of those things, like I said, sort of anecdotally and qualitatively that we've been talking about has been how we're seeing some severe weather and some things happening in perhaps non-climatological or at the fringes of the climatology, so those climatologies might actually be transitioning and changing. Certainly, if we consider like what happened the previous December, so December of 2021, we had that huge tornado outbreak with really strong tornadoes in Kentucky, and so certainly we don't expect to see really intense supercellular development and big, strong tornadoes during, the winter season in December. And so, and we're also seeing, the hurricane seasons expanding on both ends. They're happening earlier in the year. So in May, we're seeing tropical cyclone formation, and we're seeing, storms happening, into November and, and more intense in the latter part of that season. So it's possible that those seasons could be expanding because of increasing temperatures, but certainly there could be other possibilities. So I wish I had more intelligence driven by actual data rather than just anecdotally, but that's at least, one take on what we might be seeing.
Yeah, this is Pam. I think it's important to keep in mind that we have historically had tornadoes every month of the year in the Southeast, especially in the southern parts of it. And so it's still rare, but it's not that surprising because we're in the middle of having all these fronts come through, and we have return flow from the Gulf of Mexico, so moisture is available. And so there's really two peaks in the Southeast. One is the bigger peak in the spring with a secondary peak in the fall, but every month of the year we have the chance of getting severe weather, and this is one of those years when we had a big outbreak.
Thank you, Pam and Karen. Any more comments from the panelists?
This is Chris. I'll just add on to that too. There's also natural climate variability at play here as well when it comes to a lot of these severe weather outbreaks, and we've been in a La Niña pattern now for several years, and there's statistical evidence just based on the record that we have going back many decades that severe weather outbreaks, especially across the central and southern part of the United States, can be more frequent during La Niñas, and so that's related to changes in the large-scale circulation, the jet stream, all the ingredients that sort of have to come together to get a large-scale severe weather outbreak. La Niña sort of can prime the region for that and sort of bring all those ingredients together in a way that we might see these events more frequently. And of course, climate change, as was alluded to before, certainly plays a role there as well. So you have those changes taking place along with natural variability, and when you put those two together, you can certainly notice some trends and certainly some changes taking place as well.
Great, thank you. One more question here, and this one is related to what's called flash drought. So for those of you not familiar, flash drought is considered a drought that intensifies very quickly. And this one is related to impacts of being able to forecast these types of rapidly intensified flash droughts during the fall season when prescribed fire is extremely common in the Southeast. So I think we're a little far to predict what's going to happen in the fall, but does any of our speakers have a comment relating to flash drought, rapid intensified drought, and prescribed fire in the Southeast? I know this is a topic of interest, and maybe we can actually look to have a speaker speak on this later in the year as well. So I'll open that up for any reaction.
Hi, this is Pam. Flash drought is, if you'll excuse the expression, a hot topic right now. And so people are very interested in looking at prediction of flash drought, which is primarily driven by high temperatures and really lack of rainfall, both of which are related to high pressure that becomes stationary over an area over time. Fall's already a pretty dry period in most of the southeast, so it's really hard to predict on useful timescales. I think when a flash drought's going to happen, it's one of those things where you know it when it's happening, but you're just kind of watching carefully for the next few weeks ahead. I think there's a lot of work that's going to be done on that in the next few years. I'm not sure how much has actually been accomplished yet.
Great, thank you. I think that's all we're going to take right now. We do have a comment from one of our speakers, just reminding you that tornadoes in the deep south is often associated with La Niña. This has been a very interesting 3-year La Niña study to see how much it might be good for us to go back, Chris, at one point and see how much of the traditional La Niña pattern prevailed versus some surprises. Anyways, with that, I think I'll go ahead and just thank you all again. Thank you, our presenters, to Chris, Todd, Pam, and Karen. Exceptional job as always. We look forward to seeing you all next month, and have a wonderful day.